Wow, so many friends. Last time we were in Washington, D.C., this time in Tel Aviv, which is much better. Israel is the best. So we have 4 friends and lots of topics to cover. You know, it's Israel and news happen by the hour. And I want to try and touch them all, so we'll try to be as short as possible. I refer to you, Amit. No, just kidding. There is a nice story about a young gentleman like you entering a stage to give a speech, and he starts by apologizing for having an ugly cut on his face, saying that the same morning, while he was shaving, he was thinking of his speech, so he cut his face. An elder gentleman stands up from the crowd and says to him, "Young gentleman, instead of thinking of your speech and cutting your face, you should have thought of your face and cut your speech." So bear it in mind while you speak. Okay, let's start with the most, burning issue in Israel, the judicial reform. Gili, you cover it from the diplomatic angle. Amit, you cover it from the political angle. Lahav, of course, you do the same. And Gideon, your penny, your cent on that, where we stand, where we're heading, because that tears the Israeli society for the past few months. Gili.
I'll be the young and the one who starts. First of all, I will say thank you, and I'm glad to be here, and welcome all of you to Tel Aviv. I think that Israel usually said that this is the only democratic state in this villa in the jungle, in this very tough neighborhood that we live in. And I think that the past 23 weeks demonstrated the most. The fact that each and every week there is more than 100,000 of Israelis going to the streets, not the usually common protesters in Israel, although they are a bit losing momentum last weekends. I think that this really demonstrates the fact that Israel was really proud of, the democracy values of Israel. Saying that, and from my perspective as a diplomatic correspondent, this is a topic that raises up in each and every conversation that I have, and for Israeli diplomats, of course. If it was talking usually about two-state solution or the Palestinian issue and any other major talking points, they are not on the list anymore, or they are, fifth or sixth. And the fourth and foremost is the judicial overhaul, which means a lot, which means this is the reality.
Amit, where are we heading?
Well, there is an old Chinese proverb, which I've just made up, saying that 2 things are hardest to translate, poetry and politics. So I'll try to translate it to a non-Israeli audience, and I know some of it will be lost on translation. Americans usually speak about 5 political systems. First, there was the independence, then the watershed line was the slavery, etc., etc. In Israel, we started with economy. The first political system was ruled by the question of money. Socialism versus capitalism, and socialism ruled. 25% of the Knesset members used to be kibbutz members, whereas only 3% of the Israeli population back then in the 50s belonged to kibbutz, because Israelis admired the idea of kibbutz, of socialism towards also almost communism. Then came the Yom Kippur War, and it turned to be a security question, and that was the second political system. I guess, I'm not guessing, I know that 6 years ago when we spoke at the AJC conference in Washington, 80% of the questions from the audience were about the Palestinian question. This is no longer the case, as Gili mentioned. No questions about the Palestinians, no references from foreign leaders. It's only about the judicial reform. And I claim that we've just started our 3rd political system. And it's not about the judicial reform. The judicial reform is a way to interpret the real question in Israel. Nations around their 8th or 9th decade to their existence, not nation states, start or stop asking the how questions and start asking the why questions. The how questions were, how will we shape our economic system? Socialism versus capitalism. How large Israel will be in terms of the borders? But now we came to the why questions. Who we are. Are we Jewish and democratic? 51% Jewish and 49% democratic? Or the other way around? And maybe I'll explain about it later, but it's not that the anti-reform protesters are for the Supreme Court. They are for the Supreme Court because it represents the liberal values in their opinion. So they want to preserve the power of the Supreme Court, and it goes the other way around. The pro-reform protesters are not against the idea of judicial activism. They don't want this specific activism when the Supreme Court consists of a liberal majority. So it's about the values rather than the judiciary.
Lahav?
So what I think this judicial reform debate has really brought out into the open for anyone who was not paying attention before this is deep flaws in Israel's system of government. Because how do you have a system where both sides of the debate feel like they're disenfranchised? I mean, the right has been winning elections for the past 14 years, and the right feels like they're disenfranchised because they feel that the institutions, whether it's the government bureaucracy or the Supreme Court, are against them. And the left feels disenfranchised because they basically can't win an election anymore. But both sides, in a way, are right, because we have a really flawed government system here. First of all, with the main problem, really, and the core of a lot of these things, when we're talking about the way the system works in Israel, is that we don't have a real separation of powers. The executive's power fully comes from the legislature, except that it's sort of turned on its head. The executive tells the legislature what to do because we don't have a system where most of the parties have primaries, and even the parties that do have primaries, Likud has a sort of very vibrant culture within the Likud, but there's hero worship of Netanyahu, so even the primary system doesn't prevent it from being sort of a party of one man, even though he was elected by a majority of the members of Likud. When you don't have this separation of powers, when the executive always tells the legislature what to do, so first of all, yes, the only sort of bulwark against the tyranny of the majority is the Supreme Court, even though the Supreme Court has sort of taken on all sorts of authorities that it didn't necessarily, or wasn't necessarily intended to have when the structure was put together. And on the other hand, you have a situation where the opposition is, doesn't really do that. They give a lot of speeches, but they don't really have a chance of ever getting anything done. And so both sides right now are very upset because each side feels like they can't win. And who knows what will happen with these negotiations that are happening in Bet HaNassi right now. But a good outcome, I think, would be a real deep change in the system that would address the flaws that make everybody unhappy.
Gideon?
First of all, let me thank the organizers and all of you for inviting me. I cannot take it for granted. I have a reputation of someone who spoils any Zionistic party. I try not to do it tonight, but I highly appreciate the opportunity to express some different voices. When it comes to the protest movement, I must tell you I'm quite torn. On one hand, nobody can be indifferent to this phenomena of hundreds of thousands of Israelis going week after week to protest, to fight over democracy, to fight over human rights, to fight over the legislations which they perceive as very, very dangerous. But in the same time, there are two big elephants in the room, and one is half hidden and the other one is totally hidden. The one big elephant in the room is obviously Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the most beloved and the most hated Prime Minister Israel had ever had. And Netanyahu is present in this protest as an elephant in the room that we don't look at it, because I believe that most of the motivation of the protesters are to get rid of Benjamin Netanyahu. They don't say it, but that's the main motivation. And they cover it up with all kinds of other important issues. But by the end of the day, this protest will not be over until Netanyahu will step down. You can support it, you can be against it, but that's the truth. The bigger elephant, obviously, in the room is obviously the Israeli occupation, which is not an occupation anymore, because occupation, by definition, is a temporary phenomena. We are speaking about a phenomena of 57 years now. This is not temporary. There is no end by the horizon even to this occupation, and it does define Israel. The occupation defines Israel. The occupation defines the regime of Israel. We think that we will ignore it, we will fight over democracy for the Jews, and ignore the fact that in Israel, 5.5 million Palestinians are living under our control and are not part of the game. More than this, part of them are the only people in the world without citizenship. Can you ignore this when you fight over democracy? Can you close one eye and say, okay, we are fighting here about reform, about Supreme Court, and totally hide the fact that there are millions of people who are not part of this game, who have no rights whatsoever? And because I think that the occupation defines the regime of Israel, and because I think that you cannot be half a democracy, like you can't be half pregnant. Many times we would like maybe to be half pregnant, it doesn't work. You can't be half a democracy. And you can't possess a tyranny in your backyard and claim that you are a democracy. And as long as this, thank you. And as long as this brutal tyranny is in our backyard, all the talkings about democracy and all the protests to improve the democracy are hollow. And last sentence, there was also a democracy in South Africa. There were elections, there was free press. The only problem is that not everyone participated.
South Africa. I have family from South Africa.
Okay, let me finish.
But that's not true. It's just false.
There were elections in South Africa. Did anyone in the world perceive South Africa as a democracy because there were elections in South Africa? Did anyone perceive South Africa as a democratic state and the Supreme Court?
We said short.
Finished. I raised my case.
I could have opened it now to a debate vis-à-vis the Palestinian issue, but we have very limited time and many topics. I want to, Amit, really short, still the judicial reform, how is it going to end? Because, you know, we have so many people coming from outside of Israel looking at that, very much concerned of what's going on in here, asking themselves questions, even regarding the U.S. Israeli relationship, which, you know, we're seeing Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu not receiving an invitation to the White House. So very shortly, because I want to touch other topics as well, how is it going to end?
The judicial reform is dead, but no one has informed the family yet. Now, what is the judicial reform? The very idea, the speech that the Justice Minister has given 5 months ago included 150% of the reform he had wanted to pass in the first place. He thought it would be like a, what you call a pork barrel policy, that he'll give and take, that he'll compromise on 50% and get whatever he wanted. But he didn't understand that you cannot take this method, these tactics of passing bills, you know, to introduce something very severe and then to compromise when it gets to the very gist of the soul of a country or the soul of a political camp. So I think it's dead, and I think that there is an option. I mean, Netanyahu will try to have the negotiations in the president's residence like he held the negotiations with the Palestinians.
Forever.
Exactly. But there is no John Kerry to travel from Washington to Jerusalem 14 times.
Perhaps a terror talk.
Exactly. But problem is that when it comes to economy and high-tech industry, this policy or this tactics is very bad because meanwhile, the high-tech industry is suffering heavy losses. So my gamble is that somewhere between days and months, Netanyahu will take 5% of the judicial reform, declare a victory, and retreat, like in Vietnam.
And just one thing, looking from the outside, Netanyahu and his people speak differently in English in the US or in Europe, and in Hebrew to us, Israel is totally different phrases and words that we're hearing. Gili, I've mentioned the Israeli-American relationship. From the diplomatic angle, I want to touch the diaspora angle afterwards. The diplomatic angle, is it going to improve between Biden and Netanyahu?
Let's all cross our fingers and hope for. I think that Israel and the U.S. relations shapes basically Israel's approach towards the area. I mean, we cannot talk Iran, we cannot talk about normalization with the Saudis, we cannot talk on basically on each and every subject without the Americans in the room. But Netanyahu used to or tend to lean on some left politician and in his government in order to have some of excuse why his ideology is not getting into reality. And now his left politician that he leans on is basically Biden. So I think that while Netanyahu is still waiting for the invitation which is not coming or which is not arriving, this is shaping or influence the way he treats to any major subject. I mentioned Iran. I think that the fact that we are not hearing Netanyahu as vocal as we used to hear him regarding Iran is basically because he's not invited, and basically because he's still in a wait-and-see mode. So this is truly in the room while Netanyahu is still in such an uncertain position.
Lahav, looking at the diaspora angle of that, and furthermore, you know, many of our friends here are non-Orthodox. They are Reformed, they are conservative. Most of the U.S. Jewish people are non-Orthodox, but this is a very Orthodox government who's going for many pro-Orthodox reforms. It's an interesting way to use it.
The only reform thing in the government is the judicial reform.
Exactly.
So this is the closest.
I remember that. So how is it going to look? Because from our friends here point of view.
Well, I don't think I have to tell the people in the audience what their own point of view is, but I do think that to speak very broadly, when I speak to groups from abroad coming to Israel or when I go to them on my tours, they tend to be somewhat confused, like what is happening in Israel? Everything just seems to be blowing up. It seems to be like a total disaster. And I try to explain that on the one hand, everyday life really is continuing as usual. Like we're not, you know, there were a few days here and there where things were really disrupted, but overall, like we're living our lives. But at the same time, it's a real reckoning with problems that have been bubbling under the surface for a long time. In terms of the religion and state issues, the thing is that there's just no constituency in Israel for the sort of non-Orthodox institutions that American Jews are used to. So when Israelis talk about being secular, they mean that they almost never go to synagogue. They might like fast in Yom Kippur and they'll have a Seder, you know, the vast majority of Israelis have a Seder on Pesach, but they're not going to, they're not interested in a Reform or conservative synagogue.
David Ben-Gurion used to say that he's not going to a synagogue, but the synagogue he's not going to is Orthodox.
Right.
So this is what being secular in Israel means.
Right. It's exactly. It's that very famous statement. When Israelis say secular, they mean secular. They don't mean reform. And I think that sometimes U.S. Jews have trouble understanding that. On the other hand, liberal Israelis believe that everyone should sort of have the right to worship the way they want to worship. The problem is that, as I had said before, the left can't really win an election in Israel, and the far right, you know, in theory, Likud is the liberal right-wing party, right? That, you know, is for individual rights. The thing is that, first of all, they've been, to some extent, there's a rising populist right in Likud, which is similar to things you see all over the world, including the US. And in addition, you have the far right and the Orthodox parties, which in a coalition system just really hold a lot of leverage. And so even if, you know, if you were to ask Netanyahu in secret what he thinks, he would probably be fine with women reading the Torah at the Kotel. He can't say it and he can't do it because his political future is on the line.
But I want to be tough on that, and you can, Gideon, we can start with you, but any of you can add to that. You all should know, or know very well, and Netanyahu better than any of us, that our friends here are an essential part of Israel's existence, strength, defense, international ties, etc., etc. When I give lectures to the Israeli army and to the high-rank officers, and I say the two legs that prevent 250 million Arabs in the Middle East or 2 million Muslims from marching over and taking us over, one is Dimona, and the other thing is the U.S., 300 million Americans standing behind Israel, which you represent, most of the people here. And the current government, in a way, deters them. When we see ministers this week in Los Angeles not gaining meetings with Jewish leaders, in Washington, in Pennsylvania, etc., that resembles to the world that Israel and the Jewish people from within are tethered, and Israel is less secure, less stronger. We saw in last Passover, Israel is being attacked from all fronts, North Gaza, West Bank, at the same time, because the Arab world feels that Israel is weaker.
Israel is, first of all, extremely strong military, and this you know better than I. It's a regional superpower, and I wouldn't get to all kind of pessimistic appreciation about this.
But don't be so disappointed about it. I mean,
I
it's
am.
strong, but it's okay.
I am.
Okay.
The problem is, and we will repeat it again and again, that Israel is living on its sword. And you can't live on your sword forever. And if we think that the solution will always be building new walls and tunnels and getting the best weapons in the world, you really think that this will guarantee us forever? Or in other words, we have to ask ourselves, with the United States or without them, where are we heading? Where are we going to? What will be here? We are now between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, half and half, Palestinians and Jews. That's a matter of fact. What will be here in 20 years' time, in 30 years' time, in 50 years' time? Are we really trusting only the weapons that we'll get? We tried all the military options in the last 75 years. We were very powerful, and look where we got. Is the time to restart the whole project, to rethink what is the solution finally? Where are we going to? I leave it open as it is.
One thing for sure in 50 years, Netanyahu will be prime minister.
Yeah, that's
I don't know anything
doubt.
else. Amit?
Not sure which Netanyahu.
And by the way, Amit Segal will be in Channel 12.
Yes, exactly.
And he will still be 30.
And you'll write about the occupation.
Absolutely.
Because
From the grave, from my
everybody
grave.
has to earn something for living. Anyway, Yossi Beilin once wrote, the former Justice Minister, he wrote a book named The Death of the American Uncle. It was 25 years ago, and he claimed, not the uncle died, I think he meant that the relationship that Israelis had with the American Jewry was dead in the sense that we are no longer the young sibling or the young nephew needs help. And his solution was to establish Taglit. okay, in order to foster the connections between the young generation and Israel. The young generation, so it's not the uncle, it's the cousins. And I think what we see now is that we are second cousins once removed. Now, the first generation, brothers usually call each other, visit each other, right? The cousins call each other on Passover, Rosh Hashanah, to say hi. The second cousins, once removed, have to go to MyHeritage in order to find the names and to see, wow, we are relatives. I really don't think we should be at that stage. And this is the real problem, that we have to go back to basics, as basketball commentators usually say, to abandon the idea that we should hug the Christian community in the States as a way to substitute the relationship with the American Jewry. So maybe we should go to MyHeritage and find that we are relatives.
Gili? Lahav?
I will say, just to conclude Amit's idea, that we need also to acknowledge the fact that we need to hear those voices. They are well-spoken, and we need to hear them, although it might be harsh sometimes, but this is what family do. They fight, and it's okay.
When they stop fighting, it begins to be a problem.
Exactly.
Lahav?
I agree with all the sentiments. I'm just not very optimistic that it's going to change because I have heard people say these things since I've been doing this since 2011. So I've been hearing these things the whole time and seeing, that ultimately politics win. And, to add to Amit, sort of like many, many quotes, Henry Kissinger once said that Israel has no foreign policy, it only has domestic policy. So I am become very cynical about the fact that Israel doesn't have that much of a diaspora policy, it just has domestic politics.
I think with policy and without policy, one of, at least my biggest hopes is the young generation of the Jewish American community. You see more and more, maybe not all of you will agree that it's a hope. For people like me, it's a great hope, maybe the greatest hope today. What is happening in campuses, what is happening in Jewish community centers. There's a new generation who wants to redefine the term friendship, because friendship does not necessarily mean always blind support, unconditioned support. Friendship means also being critical. Friendship means also saying tough things if needed. When you have a relative or a friend who is addicted to drugs, who is a drug addict, you have two ways to deal with him. One is to supply him with money. He will be very grateful, but is it friendship? Is it care? The other way is to force him to go for rehabilitation. That's, in my view, real friendship or real care. And Israel needs rehabilitation because Israel is addicted to the occupation.
Gideon, thank you very much on that. Since I believe we should end up with a smile, but with something to think.
I'm smiling.
Listen, I know. You're the only one from the Palestinian side who smiles, I remind you.
I'm not in the Palestinian side. No, I'm in the
I'll tell you a
Jewish-Israeli
story,
side.
I'll tell you a story which I've heard in the US quite a few years ago, which is still relevant today. It says of a bank in Fifth Avenue, one of the biggest banks, let's say Chase Manhattan Bank, who has a huge building in Fifth Avenue, and on the top, on the roof, they have a huge neon sign, says, "You have got a friend in Chase Manhattan Bank." Came over one of the big Israeli banks, which one? Bank Leumi, opened their branch opposite in Chase Manhattan's, and they said, we approached the Jewish community of New York, so they put a huge neon red sign on the top of their building writing, "You have got a mishpucha in Bank Leumi." The people of Chase Manhattan Bank saw it. Took them a week, and they've changed their sign and wrote, "If you have got a mishpucha in Bank Leumi, you really need a friend in Chase Manhattan Bank." Ladies and gentlemen, it's been an honor. Have a nice time in Israel. Thank you.
Thank you very much.